Hi folks, welcome back. At the end of my last video, I mentioned how the system of molecular biology is irreducible complexity to the utmost. Well, today I want to expand on that topic of irreducible complexity. And I want to begin by reminding you what the dogma of molecular biology is. And we'll do that with this slide. This is, once again, the complete version of the dogma of molecular biology, the one that the evolutionists don't want you to see. And as a reminder, here's the version that they teach everyone in just about every science class. And as I said before, this is intentionally and strategically left incomplete, because once you learn the complete version, you realize that the dogma of molecular biology is impossible to explain scientifically. So now, back to the complete version. As I've explained, the problem here for evolution is that this is a closed loop. We see here that the process of transcription creates RNA from DNA, and the process of translation creates proteins from RNA. And the process of replication creates more DNA from existing DNA. But in addition to that, the proteins in the RNA are used to make the RNA in the proteins. And the proteins in the RNA are also used to make more DNA. So you need the proteins in the RNA to make the RNA in the proteins. You cannot have the RNA in the proteins without first having the RNA in the proteins. And you need the RNA in the proteins to make the DNA in the first place. Furthermore, you need existing DNA for all this. So you need the one to get the other two, but you also need the other two to get the one. You cannot have the DNA without the RNA and proteins and existing DNA, but you cannot have the RNA and proteins without the DNA. You first need the RNA and the proteins to exist before you can make the RNA and proteins. And you first need the DNA to exist before you can make the DNA that's made from DNA and RNA and proteins that you don't have yet. So you need all these pieces of the puzzle to exist before you can make them. You need A to make B and C, but you need B and C to make A to make B and C. And like I said before, by now your head should be spinning. And if it is, that's a good thing, because that means you understand that what I just said makes no sense. It's just not possible. How can you have something before it's made? So it becomes the classic chicken and the egg scenario. Which came first? And the only possible answer is none of the above. None of them individually came first before any of the rest of them. The only scientifically possible explanation is that they all had to come first, together, at the same time. It's the only possible way all these life-essential functions can exist. The DNA, RNA, and proteins necessary for these processes to occur must have all shown up simultaneously in one moment. It's impossible, scientifically, for the required components of this biological system to have arisen gradually over time, because all the parts are required from day one, or the system will not operate. And if the system will not operate, life cannot exist. Period. And as I've told you before, there are about 300 molecules required for these life-essential processes to occur. There's about 200 RNA molecules, and about 100 proteins. Each of them is required for these processes to go. And that's just to turn the machines on, so to speak, before you actually start making all the RNA and all the proteins required to create a species. And I went through a few of those in the last video when I explained a few of them that are involved in the process of transcription. But actually, there are more than 300 molecules required. For example, there are up to 2,800 proteins in the human genome that have DNA binding domains. And that means they can bind to DNA. Of these, as many as 1,600 are presumed to be transcription factors. I mentioned this in the previous video, how there are half a dozen other proteins that are required to help RNA polymerase II do its job of making RNA. Those guys are the transcription factors. They're ones that are included in my list of about 300 molecules required for the processes of molecular biology to function. But there are many more that help RNA polymerase II do its job in a gene-specific fashion. They're responsible for producing transcription regulation that's unique for each gene in the human genome. Many of these bind to the enhancer regions or the repressor regions of the gene and either turn the gene on or turn it off, or impact the amount of RNA that can be made from the gene. So the point is this: the number of 300 molecules required for the system of molecular biology to function, just to turn the machines on, so to speak, is actually much higher. And back to this slide again. You need the RNA and proteins and DNA to make the RNA and proteins. And you need the RNA and proteins and DNA to make DNA. So you need RNA and proteins and DNA before you have RNA, proteins, and DNA. And like I said before, how can you have something before you can make it? It makes no sense, which is exactly why it cannot be explained scientifically, right? Hopefully you get that. Evolution says that these parts arose gradually, all by themselves, and then self-assembled. But that's impossible since, like I said, there's a mountain of data that shows that they're all required at the same time, and none of these molecules can self-assemble. Those are the data. These molecules must be assembled by the other molecules that are essential in these processes. And like I talked about in previous videos, they have to be assembled just like you're assembling Legos. They must be put together by all those other molecules that are required for these processes. So evolution is impossible scientifically because all these parts must be there together at the same time for these processes to function. Therefore, the only way the system of molecular biology can function is for all of these molecules to have arisen at the same time. With any of these molecules missing, critical parts of the processes won't happen. And if any of the steps in these processes don't happen, life can't happen. Therefore, as I've already explained, all of these molecules have to be here at the same time, functioning together, or life cannot exist. They cannot accumulate gradually over time because they're all needed from day one. And folks, that's irreducible complexity to the utmost. Irreducible complexity is a term coined by biochemist Dr. Michael Behe. Irreducible complexity means that the sum of the parts, subunits or components, are all needed in their entirety at the same time for a system to function and function properly. Without the sum of all the parts working together, a system cannot function. A gradual accumulation of these parts does an organism no good. They cannot function independently, so they're useless on their own. But it doesn't stop at just the presence of the parts. The parts must also be functioning together. They must be created such that all the components fit and align with each other in the proper arrangement for the system to function. Each subunit must have a portion of it that can interact appropriately with all the other subunits as needed for the system as a whole. All the parts are equally necessary, so they all must arise and be present at the same time for the system to function. Therefore, you cannot remove a subunit or a component from a system or develop the system gradually, because all of them are required together and simultaneously. For example, if you remove the transmission from a car, or the wheels, or the fuel, or whatever, the car cannot operate. Therefore, evolution has more problems. How can different subunits that would arise gradually, randomly, and independently know not only their own structural needs and function, but also the structural needs to interact with and function in concert with other subunits before each one even exists? How can evolution create such systems that have subunits that are able to fit and align with all the other subunits so that they can work in concert to create a functioning system when the subunits arise gradually, randomly, and independently? Irreducible complexity is another insurmountable problem for evolution. Evolution has no answer for it. And there are countless examples of it throughout the animal and plant kingdoms. First of all, everything that I reviewed with you to this point in the structure and functions of DNA, RNA, and proteins is an example of irreducible complexity on a massive scale. And I still have a lot more to share with you in future videos. Other examples include things like the bacterial flagellum, the woodpecker, the pressure handling adaptations of fish that exist at different depths in the ocean, the giraffe, the human eye, the breathing mechanisms of marine mammals, and on and on and on. It just continues. They're not isolated incidents. They're commonplace. In fact, they're an integral part of life. They're found everywhere in nature, and what I want to do is discuss a few of them with you, starting with one in this video and in the next. And the one I want to start with here is the bacterial flagellum, which is the ambulatory propeller for some bacteria. The bacterial flagellum is basically a water-cooled proton rotary motor that can spin at 100,000 RPM. It's made of two gears, forward and reverse, a rotor, a U-joint, a drive shaft, a propeller, and a stator that all function the same way the machine parts with the same names do. And it can stop and change gears or change directions on a dime. Without every one of these parts present and working together, the bacterial flagellum does not function. Within the concept of irreducible complexity, a gradual accumulation of these parts does an organism no good. Having one or even two or three of these parts without the others is useless as a flagellum, as is having one or even two or three of these parts on their own. They cannot function independently, so they're useless. And by definition of evolution, they provide no adaptational advantage. Therefore, individual subunits are useless, and they would be selected against by evolution. Evolution would select them out of the population. Irreducible complexity means that you must know the required subunits both individually and how they function together within a system ahead of time in order to strategically, intentionally, and intelligently create and partner the subunits exactly as required in the design of the structure and function of the system as a whole. Now, I already cited this in a previous video, but I'm going to do it again here. In The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin wrote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." Well, guess what? Irreducible complexity absolutely breaks down his theory. Darwin was correct in his understanding of the death sentence of irreducible complexity, even before he even knew or understood what it was. And I'll tell you something else. Charles Darwin no longer believes in evolution. I guarantee it. Now, I'm going to stop this video here, but in the next video, I'm going to move on to some other examples of irreducible complexity. So come on back for that. And if you like what you hear, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much for watching. And as always, we'll leave the light on for you.